Shall I give you your laptop back? Do you want your machine? Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you, Jonathan. That's a very, very kind introduction, which is setting me up for a massive fall in terms of the lucidity of the presentation to come. But I can certainly agree that I'm very, very happy to be back in California. I lived in San Diego 2001 to 2007, and every time I come back, I wonder why on earth I ever left. It's a beautiful part of the world. And mind you, last time I saw Jonathan was in Taormina in Sicily, which is also a very beautiful part of the world in Europe. But I don't live there either, so there we go. So I want to firstly say thank you to Jonathan and to John Hayder for hosting me, inviting me here. I'm leaving tomorrow. I've been here since Monday, and it's been a phenomenal few days, and I've especially enjoyed meeting a lot of the graduate students and learning about the wonderful projects that are being done here. It's been really inspirational. And also, it's a delight to be in the presence again of Mike Gazaniga, who I just saw here, whose work, like so many of us, I think, work for me, was a major inspiration in me getting interested and involved in consciousness research in the first place. And so it's a great honour to be here as well. So, I'm going to talk to you about quite a whirlwind tour, I think, through of various things I'm interested in. And towards the end, we're going to get to this issue of the substrate-dependent nature, the possible substrate-dependent nature of consciousness in terms of its intimate dependence on our nature as living systems, biological systems. So I won't get there until the end, but maybe just hold it in your mind and sort of think, this is where we're going to go, because it's quite it's a view not shared by too many of my colleagues, safe to say. And it's not a view that I know to be right either. It's just a view I think should be taken seriously. So consciousness in humans and in other things. Well, talks on consciousness are invariably plagued by the need to define terms. What is consciousness? What are we talking about? There is no consensus definition of this term. I don't think that's necessary, so long as we have a vague idea. As long as we're not talking past each other. So you know what I mean by consciousness. And I think that can be explained fairly simply. We're all familiar with consciousness. It's simultaneously something deeply mysterious but intimately familiar. Consciousness is what you lose every night when you fall into a dreamless sleep. Not when you're dreaming, but when you fall into a dreamless sleep, consciousness goes away. Even more profoundly, when you go under general anesthesia. For me, that's a very good definition of consciousness. It's what isn't there when you get turned into an object under general anesthesia. Another way to think of consciousness very broadly is that it's comprised both of experiences of the world around us. This is from outside my very nice hotel. Thank you again, Sage Centre, for accommodating me by the ocean. And when you open your eyes, your brains do more than just respond to signals. There's a whole experiential dimension. We see, we experience colours, shapes, sounds, sights, smells. That's what consciousness involves, the experiential element of what brains, bodies, and the world do. And then, of course, within this experiential process, there's also the experience of self. We humans, at any rate, we always experience being who we are, being me, or, as I use in the book, being you. There's an experience of selfhood, which is complex, but which is perhaps that aspect of experience that is most important to each of us, the experience of being who we are. Now, in terms of a little bit more formal definition, I tend to go back to Thomas Nagel, who had this very famous paper in the early 1970s about what it might be like to be a bat. But he also introduced this definition of consciousness, which I think is very useful because it's very general. He says an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something it is like to be that organism. There is something it is like to be a conscious thing compared to a non-conscious thing. And I think this is best put in terms of the fact that it feels like something to be me. It feels like something to be each one of you. It probably feels like something to be a bat, as in Thomas Nagel's famous paper. But it probably doesn't feel like anything to be this lectern, this pointer, this watch or this laptop computer, though some people might disagree about the computer. For at least some of these things, there's nothing going on for that thing to be a thing. And I think this is a good general definition because it it doesn't associate consciousness with things that can, I think, mislead us if we tie consciousness too closely to things other than the basic fact that experiencing is going on, like intelligence, like language, like metacognition maybe. All of these things may characterize human self-consciousness or human consciousness in some way, but maybe not consciousness in general. And I think this is very important when we're faced with some of the developments these days, and we'll get to this, like artificial intelligence, like brain organoids, like patients with severe brain damage. I mean, the key question there is there any kind of experience going on? Not so much what kind. So that's, I think, a useful definition. And of course, when we have this definition of consciousness, then we have a challenge. How do we explain how consciousness happens, how it comes to be part of the world in which we live? This is David Chalmers, well-known philosopher, particularly well-known in these waters for coining the hard problem of consciousness, and rather the distinction between a hard problem and the easy problem of consciousness. Now this is, I think, the most popular modern landmark for what is really a very ancient conundrum about how one might relate mind, matter, mind, body, however you want to talk about it. It's been a problem for thousands of years. But Chalmers crystallizes it in a way that has had particular grip on philosophers and scientists since the early 1990s. And he puts it like this after quite some preamble. He says, "Why should physical processing give rise to a rich inner life at all? It seems objectively unreasonable that it should, and yet it does." The hard problem for Chalmers is to have an answer to this question. What is it about matter, arranged somehow or made out of some kind of stuff, that gives rise to or means there's some identity relationship with any kind of conscious experience whatsoever? Chalmers contrasts this with the easy problem or easy problems, which are problems that either are about how the brain works that don't mention consciousness at all, or that limit themselves to saying things about correlations between what happens in conscious experience and things in the brain. The easy problems are not easy. They drive basically everything that people do in neuroscience these days, and we don't understand how the brain actually does what it does. But there's no conceptual obstacle to understanding the brain as a complex physical system capable of doing complex things. We just have to do the hard work and figure it out. The intuition that I think Chalmers is pumping here is that even if we did solve all the easy problems, there would still be this fundamental mystery, pristine and untouched, about how and why consciousness has anything to do with it at all. So we're not going to get, that's the, again, other terms like explanatory gap and so on. That's the hard problem. Now, one can either, there are many responses to this. You can either sort of try and tackle it head on. So I know you had Christoph Koch here last week talking about IIT, which is an attempt to tackle the hard problem head on. Or you can pretend consciousness doesn't exist, like illusionists like to do. Or you can pretend it's everywhere and fundamental, like panpsychists like to do. I like to take a different approach, which mainly to annoy David Chalmers, I've called the real problem of consciousness. And this is not a new approach, it's really just a different way of talking about what a lot of people, and including people in this room, are doing anyway. And the idea of the real problem approach is to basically accept that conscious experiences exist, they are real, in fact they're probably the only thing we can be really sure about. And understand not how and why they exist in the first place, but try and explain how their properties can be accounted for in terms of underlying mechanisms. Now, what do I mean by this? It means something like explaining why vision feels the way vision feels like, why olfactory experience has the character that it does and is different from an emotional experience, or an experience of free will, or something like that. And this recognizes that consciousness is not just one big scary problem, but a whole bunch of related problems that we can make progress on. So the long form of that is to say the real problem is about how can mechanisms and processes in the brain and the body explain, predict, and control properties of consciousness. Functional properties, so things we do in virtue of being conscious, but critically phenomenological properties. These are properties of what experiences are like at the level of experience. The redness of red, the way in which visual experiences appear with their spatiality and so on. And explanation, prediction, and being able to control things, I mean, that's what we standardly ask of the science of anything. We want to be able to explain its properties and ideally predict and control them. We don't always require the science to explain how and why something exists in the first place. I mean, physics in general has done a great job of allowing us to explain, predict, control properties of the universe, but has not told us why there's a universe in the first place to explain. So we can get a long way, and my suspicion is we put a kind of different bar when it comes to consciousness and what we think would be an intuitive explanation, because we are ourselves conscious. And so we have this sort of apparent immediate acquaintance with the thing we're trying to explain. So this is neither the hard problem, it's not the easy problem. It's not the hard problem because we're not trying to solve this like big scary mystery. And it's not an easy problem because we're not sweeping consciousness under the carpet and just studying the brain as a complex piece of biology. It's not new, of course, many people have been doing this. In particular, this whole approach inherits from neurophenomenology, which was another tradition in the sort of mind-brain sciences, which really took seriously the nature of experience and how one might relate it to underlying mechanisms. People like Francisco Varela were very key in this method, but it has some sort of different emphases. So I like to think that this is the promise, and I don't know whether this will happen, but this is the idea that as one goes about explaining, predicting, controlling properties of things, the mystery of the hard problem of consciousness isn't solved, but it's dissolved. Bit by bit, the sense of mystery about how matter and conscious experience relate will begin to sort of fade and may eventually disappear and vanish in a puff of metaphysical smoke. Now, it may not get all the way. There may be some residue of mystery that exists, but at least I think we can make a lot of progress and understand a lot more. And I think this is already happening. I think the sense of mystery surrounding consciousness, I think, is already beginning to recede. And that, I think, is very promising. So let's see if we can get any way towards that in the rest of this talk. And there's a historical parallel for this too. It's not a perfect parallel. And we can talk about this later, how the extent to which it applies. But in the history of biology, life was once thought to be also beyond the reach of any explanation in terms of physics and chemistry. 150 years ago, the philosophy of vitalism was very dominant, where people thought that, well, we can't ever explain the difference between the living and the non-living in terms of physics and chemistry, so there has to be something else, a spark of life, an élan vital. That's vitalism. It's very, very dominant. What happened, of course, is people did not find the spark of life, nor prove that life doesn't exist, but rather stopped focusing on life as a single big mystery, but in fact as something that has many aspects: homeostasis, reproduction, metabolism. Explain, predict, control these things, and the hard problem of life wasn't never solved, but it dissolved. And although we don't understand everything about life, there is no longer this sense that it's beyond the reach of the tools that we have. So life is not the same thing as consciousness, but it just goes to show, I think, that just because something seems mysterious now with the tools that we have now does not mean that it will always seem mysterious. So we can divide life up in all sorts of ways. How do we do with consciousness? Well, there are many ways to divide up the cake of consciousness. And I like to think of three rough divisions. And these are not independent, but we can to some extent study them independently. So there's conscious level, how conscious you are, the difference between anesthesia and wakefulness. There's conscious content. When you are conscious, how conscious are you? There's plenty of room at the front here, if you want to say. When you are conscious, what are you conscious of? How do we explain the sight, sound, smell, shapes, and so on that populate our conscious scene at any one time? And then there's conscious self. You mentioned this already, the specific experience of being an individual, being you, or being me. Now, this is part of conscious content, but it's a very, I think, important part that deserves separate emphasis. So today, in the rest of this talk, I'm just going to touch on each of these three aspects of consciousness, give you a sense of how one might go about making progress on them. So we'll start with conscious level. And the first thing to say about conscious level is that, well, to the extent that it's one dimension, which I think it is not, but we can at least think of gross differences between different stages of sleep and anesthesia and wakefulness. There's roughly speaking, a longer scale. It's not the same thing as wakefulness. physiological wakefulness. They're correlated. Here I'm plotting them in two different axes. This is a figure that appears in different ways in many papers now. Often they're correlated, so when you're under anesthesia, you have low physiological wakefulness, you're also unconscious. When you are awake and aware as you are now, you're both awake and aware. But you can go off this diagonal in both directions. When you're dreaming, you're having conscious experiences, and you're asleep. That's part of dreaming, unless you're daydreaming. You can dream when you're asleep, so you're conscious, but you're not awake. And on the other side, there's more unusual, perhaps pathological states, mainly following brain damage, but also things like absence epilepsy, where people can be awake but not aware. So physiological arousal can coexist in the absence of consciousness. So they're not the same thing. So when we think about conscious level, we've got to be careful to track consciousness, not just physiological wakefulness. And there's many ways one can do that. One way that we've been working on in my group in Sussex for quite a long time is simply to look at the level of complexity in brain dynamics globally across the brain in these different global conscious states, conscious levels. We use a particular measure called Lempel-Ziv complexity. It's a well-established algorithm that comes from signal processing originally. In fact, it's what's used whenever you take a photo on your phone, you want to save it or send it, it'll compress it into a much smaller file. It uses that algorithm. What this algorithm does is it figures out how many distinct patterns there are in some data and counts the number of distinct patterns in some measure. So for a completely random pattern, if that was just visual snow, it would be uncompressible. Its Lempel-Ziv complexity would be very high. But of course, in any natural image, there's a lot of predictability. Pixels tend to be the same as their neighbours. Tend to, not always, obviously. So there's some compressibility, and this measure measures that compressibility. So it turns out it's a way of, if you like, measuring the diversity of patterns that are present in anything, whether it's brain activity, a photograph, the stock market, anything you like. Just pay attention to that. We'll talk about that later. There's many ways to calculate it. That's sort of not important for today. If we apply this to different states of consciousness, different global states of consciousness, there's a pretty robust pattern. It's turned out to be one of the more robust findings, I think, in this area. This was work done by my colleague Adam Barrett and former student Michael Shartner. In anesthesia, Lempel-Ziv complexity goes down with sedation. This is in human patients with EEG, human people with EEG. This was a later study looking at intracranial data, so from electrodes implanted into the brain in collaboration with Marcello Massimini in Italy, and recording from 4 different brain regions. The interesting thing here is that the complexity level goes down in sleep, but if you compare REM sleep with wakeful rest, it's basically the same. So there's now a dissociation here. So the complexity levels of the brain during REM sleep, which is when people are most likely to report vivid dreams, it's the same as wakefulness. But in early stages of non-REM sleep, where if you wake someone up from those states, they're the least likely to report anything going on in their minds. It's much lower. So we can here dissociate consciousness from wakefulness. And then the last study that I'll show you just in this brief run was with psychedelics. So we got some data in collaboration with Imperial College London, MEG data in this case from people either under the influence of LSD, ketamine, and psilocybin, not all at the same time, and measured the complexity of the brain signals, in this case by region, comparing the psychedelic to placebo. This is just showing the pattern for LSD. It was very similar across 15 participants. It's very similar for the other psychedelics. What's interesting here is that it goes up compared to the baseline. We had looked in a number of studies for an example where the complexity goes up compared to normal baseline waking rest and not found anything. But here's an example where it does. I think it's still the only example where this reliably happens. And of course this got wildly misreported as soon as we published this as like scientists find evidence of psychedelics being a higher state of consciousness, and we knew this anyway. And it's like totally confusing, the colloquial definition of like social political consciousness with something much more mundane, which is your brain is a bit more random when you're on a trip, which is what we found. So this work is still going. This actually led to the slightly odd suggestion that maybe you could treat people in a coma by giving them psychedelics, which I found really quite extraordinary. I don't think the ethics for that will pass muster. But you see the logic, right? Well, complexity is low, bring it up. We are, for those of you who have a little bit more mathematical inclination, there are lots of issues with the algorithm of levels of complexity that I've showed there in terms of how broadly applicable it is. So work with Fernando Rosas, Pedro Mediano, and others. We've been developing other methods for assessing the same kind of thing, like how many distinct patterns there are in some data. So there's a way of doing it using state space models, which are basically mathematical models of some observed data, in this case the x's, that's your time series that you might record. Instead of just applying some algorithm directly to that, you infer what generated that observation, and then you can estimate many things from that so-called state space model. For those of you who do imaging analysis, dynamic causal modeling, these kinds of things are all based on state space models. But this has a nice advantage that we can measure changes in complexity over faster timescales and also with a spectral decomposition. And so we can say, more complexity in this frequency band versus that frequency band, which could be an interesting thing to do. This is just showing that when we apply this to the psychedelics, we basically get the same thing, which is quite nice. So it's a validation. And we're currently applying this stuff now, and I don't have any data to show you yet, to EEG data taken from the brains of people while they are dying, which is quite interesting. There's a couple of data sets. Again, this is not done in our lab, where people have been on life support systems that have been turned off at a particular time and been able to continue recording EEG during that process. So you'll be able to see changes in these potential measures of global conscious level, as it really is lost. So that's the next time. Now, all these measures of complexity, I think they bring about, well, why? Why should this matter? Why should we be looking at these kinds of measures? And measures need to be accompanied by theory in order to have some explanatory connection to what's going on. And there are a number of theories can predict some relationship between complexity in the brain and the level of consciousness, but perhaps the most familiar and influential one, which you would have heard about last week, is integrated information theory. And I'm not going to talk too much about that because it would take the rest of the talk. But the basic idea is that conscious experiences combine both a level of integration, every conscious scene is unified, we have one conscious scene at a time, and informative, every conscious scene conveys a lot of information. Many different parts, every conscious experience is different from every other one. This is an old idea that goes way back before IIT. Actually, it's the reason this 1998 paper was one of the things that motivated me to come to California in the early 2000s, besides the weather. And so the idea of IIT is that these two things are characteristic of conscious experience, so we should look for the same properties in the dynamics or structure of the brain. Then there's a kind of homology between experience and mechanism. And I think for me, that's a very appealing aspect of IIT. So, but IIT in its full-fledged form, which Christoph would have talked about last week, is very, very ambitious. It says consciousness is something. Consciousness is integrated information. And without going into details here, that means it becomes really very difficult, almost impossible to test, because you have to know everything a system could do, even if it doesn't actually do it, in order to justify this identity between integrated information and consciousness. So our approach is a bit different. This is, again, work with Adam Barrett and Pedro and Fernando and others. We call it weak integrated information theory. So there are many routes to this basic idea. And here we're saying that the less ambitious claim, which is really that consciousness has these properties of integration and information, And so let's just try and build empirical measures of that without claiming that one, the measure is the phenomenon. This means that in practice you can write down measures which are very analogous to what's in IIT, but which you can actually apply to data. So this is why we call it a kind of weak approach. And ironically, as in many other contrasts as this form, like in network theory and so on, weak approaches are often empirically the strongest approaches to take because you can use them. So we've written this up in a paper which summarizes a bunch of mathematical measures that I won't go into today that actually illustrate this, that measure integrated information in ways that can be practically applied. So IIT is more than just one idea or one set of ideas. I think it's this rich space of connecting complexity measures to conscious experiences in all sorts of ways. You may have come across last year there was a bit of a storm, furore, bit of upset when IIT was criticised by about 120 scientists who wrote a letter, which is I think generally a bad way of doing science, writing a letter, calling IIT pseudoscience, and I think this was very damaging for the field actually. I think IIT, as Christoph will have presented, is wrong, but it has every right to be wrong. It does generate testable predictions, and I think it's part of science. And consciousness being the mystery that it is, it's a difficult judgment. What kinds of theories should we allow into the fold, so to speak? Give funding, give time at conferences. And there are some ideas which are so crackpot you wouldn't want to do that. But I think IIT is not among those. I do think, even though I don't think it's right, I do think it's valuable. Partly because we also need to think differently. Some kind of wild idea is going to be necessary, even if it's not this. Just finishing this section again, it's not only measures of complexity, another kind of approach that I've been very interested in, we're doing a lot more work on now, is emergence. These things often get conflated with consciousness too. People say consciousness emerges from the brain and in some sort of spooky way, that's how you cross this explanatory gap. But again, there's a much more prosaic way to think about this, exemplified by this flock of starlings above the pier in Brighton. When birds flock, the flock really seems to have a behaviour that's more than the sum of its parts. It seems to have an identity, agency perhaps, but certainly an identity that is difficult to ascribe just to the birds that make it up. Birds that were flying around randomly would not look like a flock. Birds flying in a rigid formation would not look like a flock either. So there's something about the flockiness of this which is intuitively appealing. That's a weak sense of emergence again. And that's as good as the surf gets in Brighton, by the way. It really is. I mean, that's a good day. And there is something that is true, that one can map that analogy at least a little bit into the brain, that we have a whole bunch of neurons, and a conscious experience seems to be like one thing. There's an integration to it. So if we can come up with measures of emergence, maybe those will give us an empirical handle on when the individual neural dynamics, the birds, are organised in a particular way that has some flockiness. Maybe we don't see it like a flock, but maybe there's some underlying mathematical principle which sort of characterises flockiness in some arbitrary space, higher dimensional space. So we've been working on this too, and this is still early days for this, but my mathematician colleague Lionel Barnett, building on work that I did about 15 years ago, which was really, really bad, because I'm not a mathematician, he did it properly, and we've come up with some measures of what he calls dynamical independence, which are just ways of taking a system and asking, is there anything flock-like going on in this system, even if it doesn't leap out to us as being flock-like? And we can identify emergent variables from sort of sets of, by recording, for instance, lots of neurons or EEG time series or whatever it might be. And I'm hopeful that this provides a way of identifying candidate things, a bit like integrated information, a bit like levels of complexity, that might track how conscious things are in a way that has some explanatory grit. So I won't go into the details about how it does it. Basically, in normal language, what that says is that an emergent property like the flock is dynamically independent to the extent that predictions about its future are independent of what's going on at the level of the individual birds. So knowing what the individual birds are doing doesn't help you predict what the flock does. Then you get this property. Okay, so that's really the first part of this talk. I want to move on now to conscious content and think about how we understand conscious content. And here's where another key idea comes in, which is the idea of your brain as a prediction machine. And I should just say, this is quite a separate idea. They're linked probably in some way, but I'm not going to attempt to link them in this talk. The idea of the brain as a prediction machine is an idea with a very, very long history. You can go back all the way to Plato and his allegory of the cave. So prisoners trapped to the wall of the cave see shadows on the walls of this cave cast by firelight. And that's all they have access to. That's all they experience of these shadows. And in the allegory, they take the shadows to be the real world, because that's all they have access to. They don't know that the shadows are an indirect reflection of something else. And now if you skip over all thousands of years in between, and instead of prisoners in a cave, think about your own brain. Think about being your own brain. And there you are. You're not in a cave now, but you're trapped in a bony vault of the skull. Pretty cave-like. It's dark in there. It's silent. You have no direct access to what's going on out there in the world. Instead of shadows cast by firelight, all you've got access to are electrical signals that only indirectly reflect things in the world, whatever they may be. And these signals, they don't come with labels on. They come from a coffee cup or a cat or a table or a person. Their electrical signals are ambiguous and they're noisy with respect to their causes in the world or in the body. So to make sense of them, which is arguably what perception to a first approximation is about, the brain has to combine these ambiguous sensory signals with its prior expectations or beliefs about the way the world or the body is. And the idea here is that's what constitutes conscious contents. It's not a readout of the sensory signals. What we experience is the brain's best guess of the causes of these signals. The brain doesn't hear sound or see light. It experiences predictions about the causes of signals which are themselves colourless and soundless. Just to give you an example of this in practice, this shows, I think, very vividly how deeply our brain's expectations about the world shape our conscious experience. How many people have seen the hollow mask illusion before in this audience? Okay, most of you, but not all of you. So in this is a very famous illusion, hollow mask illusion. And every face that you've ever seen, and that your ancestors ever seen, more or less, has always pointed outwards, with a nose poking out like that. This means your brain has very strong expectations that faces point outwards. So much so, it would seem, that your brain would rather reach the conclusion in this weird situation where a hollow mask is rotated so you see it from the inside, that you instead see two faces rotating in different directions, or the same face rotating in two directions at once, which is clearly a nonsense thing, but it's for the brain more likely than an inside-out pointing face. This works even better with a real hollow mask because the eyes follow you around. So that's one example of expectations deeply shaping our experience. Now, formally, the problem is something of a problem of Bayesian inference. The idea is there are causes of sensory signals in the world. We want to know what they are. We have some data from them. And we need to combine that data with some prior expectations to form, in Bayesian terms, the posterior, the best guess, the combination of the prior belief and the new data. Bayes' theorem has been around for a very long time. And it's really a general way of reasoning under conditions of uncertainty, which is one thing the brain is faced with in the problem of perception. Now, the first person, to my knowledge, to really propose that this is what's going on in perception was Hermann von Helmholtz, a German polymath, physicist and physiologist, who talked about perception as a process of unconscious inference. So the brain is always trying to solve this problem, trying to figure out what the causes of its sensory signals are, trying to come up with a posterior. And it does, but we're not aware of this process. For Helmholtz, it was unconscious inference. We're only aware of the outcome of this process, that being the perceptual content. So he proposed this was going on. And this sort of casts, and this line of thought has been followed now for quite a long time. And it puts, I think, views of perception in a rather different light. This is a classical picture of a visual system. This is a visual system of a macaque monkey. And in this sort of straw person picture of things, perception is a matter of reading out sensory signals from the outside in, or the bottom up. Sensory signals come into the eyes, into the retina, and progress deeper and deeper into the brain, and with more complex features being fished out as you get further into the brain. There might be some top-down influence going in the other direction, but the heavy lifting is done in this bottom-up direction. Now, the predictive brain picture changes all of this, that instead of perception being a process of reading out sensory signals, now what you've got is brain regions, this is a schematic, too many arrows, I'm sorry, sending predictions back down, cascading down from the inside of the brain back out to the sensory surfaces. And the sensory signals act as prediction errors, which serve to update the top-down predictions to keep them calibrated to their causes in the world. And it turns out that if the brain follows the very simple imperative of updating predictions to minimize prediction errors, to try and quash these sensory signals to zero, then the predictions come to approximate optimal Bayesian inference. This is one way the brain could do Bayesian inference on the causes of sensory signals, through prediction error minimization. So this broadly this theory of predictive coding or predictive processing as a theory of perception, that the brain is continually generating predictions, updating those predictions, but critically, and this isn't inherent to the theory, this is a claim that can be put on top of it, and it's my general hypothesis, what we experience are the predictions, not the bottom-up prediction errors. So we experience the world from the top down or the inside out, not from the outside in. Sort of said a little bit more informally here. Perceptual content conveyed by top-down predictions, bottom-up sensory signals convey prediction errors. That's the hypothesis. Now there's a ton of this is not a theory that I think has been established as correct, but there's a lot of evidence that's compatible with it, and I'll just share with you a couple of studies that we did. This was with Yai Pinto, who was a postdoc a few years ago. We used a technique called continuous flash suppression, and in this method, these different images are shown to the different eyes. So one eye will see this image, in this case a face, which gradually appears from zero contrast. The other eye will see a changing pattern of Mondrians, which disappear into zero contrast. The person will use a stereoscope to separate the two images, and their experience will be that they'll initially see the Mondrians, and then at some point in time the image will break through into their awareness, and we can measure when that happens by they press a button when it breaks through. They're also getting a cue, which is a word which is either congruent with the image, so in this case the word is face, the image is face, or it's incongruent. We might have the word house, or there might be an image of a house and the word face. And so the prediction is that if what we experience is constituted by, or at least strongly shaped by our experiences, then people should consciously perceive more quickly and accurately the image when the prediction that we're giving their brain is valid. It should take less time to minimize the corresponding prediction error. And that's what we see in a bunch of different experiments trying to control for various things, that people indeed, there's a quicker breakthrough time for expected stimuli, and identification is more accurate. So people see more quickly and more accurately that which they expect to see, or that which their brain expects to see, compared to that which they do not expect to see. This is all just behavioural stuff. Another experiment we did behaviourally more recently looked at this effect in memory too. And so what we did here, and I don't know if I want to go through all the details, we used a different paradigm, which is a kind of change blindness paradigm. So an array of letters comes up, it disappears, we cue a location, another array of letters comes up, and people select what they think was in the first array of letters. I think that's how it works. And they indicate their confidence in that decision. Critically, some of these letters are mirrored. They're reverse letters. So they're unexpected in the sense they're the wrong way around. And basically what we find with this, without going through the details again, is that as this memory gap increases, people falsely remember flipped letters as the right way round letters. So their memory of what happened is drawn towards like what would normally be there rather than what was actually there. This happens over a period of a few seconds. So even your short-term memory, it's not that it just decays, it's that it's biased by what your brain would expect to have been the case. So there's lots of experiments one can do showing the impact of expectations on, in this case, memory, but also conscious perception. Just one more recent thing, just to give you a sense of what we're doing now. The vanilla story about predictive coding is always that predictions go from the inside out and prediction errors come from the bottom up or outside in, but it doesn't always have to be like that. So one of the things we've been working on with colleagues of mine in machine learning is a new predictive coding architecture called hybrid predictive coding, where predictions and prediction errors flow in both directions, but at different timescales. So you have this slow cycle of prediction and prediction error, which is very good at embedding learned regularities when things in the world or the body are very stable. And then a fast, iterative kind of prediction error cycle, which is the normal predictive coding thing, which finesses, which is able to deal with unusual situations, quickly changing events, and so on. This turns out to work very well in machine learning, and one thing we want to work on in the lab now is how this model can be applied to perception. Perhaps our experience of overall context or gist is this bottom-up prediction, the more slow timescale kind of prediction, and our experience of more detailed focal events could be explained by the other mechanisms. So this makes a prediction that different directions of signal flow in the brain would be associated with these different kinds of experiences. So this is really to just illustrate that there's a lot of resources here, a lot of flexibility in using the language of the brain as a prediction machine to try and say something about different kinds of conscious experiences. And there's a lot more there that I'd love to talk about given time, but there's not enough time. One thing to emphasize is that predictive processing is not yet a theory of consciousness. At least that's not how I think of it. It's not saying what things are conscious and what things aren't conscious. But what it is doing, it's a general theory of perception and action that can be used to explain properties of phenomenology in terms of underlying mechanisms in this kind of real problem style. So it's a bridging principle that helps us get the two closer together. Now, in another recent paper with the philosopher Tim Bain, I talk about this a bit more by comparing predictive processing with some of these other, these are arguably the four dominant theories in consciousness science, though, of course, in writing this, we got into heaps of trouble from people who'd written other theories, like, why is my theory not in your top four? Which was, like, well, it isn't, is it? That's for us to decide. So that was basically our response. Though we did have a table where we could put in all the others. But the point is, all of these theories, they're all theories of different things. They all make different assumptions. They all try to explain different aspects of consciousness. So no wonder there's quite a lot of confusion in the field in the moment when people are trying to compare the different theories, because they start from different places and they want to go different places. So one challenge for the field in general, how do we make these theories more directly comparable? So we can really tease them apart in the same way that in physics, relativity and Newton were teased apart because they became specific. You could find situations they were making divergent predictions about exactly the same thing. Okay. So building on this a little further, one direction we are going in, I've taken to call something like computational phenomenology or computational neurophenomenology, the aim being to use computational models to help build these bridges from mechanism to properties of experience. And one of the contexts we're doing this in is perceptions of faces and hallucinations. So you can see a face in the cloud here. The general term for this, excuse me, I'm losing my voice. It's been a long week, is pareidolia, which is seeing patterns in things. And faces, of course, very important, very salient stimuli. We see faces in all kinds of things, in clouds, in windows on buildings, and so on. We see faces everywhere. So in one ongoing line of work, we're using neural network models to simulate hallucinations, like when people see faces when they're not there. So this is an old school neural network called AlexNet, which is very good at recognizing which objects are in images, and you show an image and activity flows up through the network and it will tell you that there's a dog in there and what breed, and so on. But you can run it the other way round. This is an algorithm called Deep Dream, which basically fixes the output to say dog, and then updates the image so that the network settles into a stable state. So the intuition here is this algorithm is basically a way of saying I'm going to enforce a prediction, in this case of dog, onto the sensory input. So intuitively it's a sort of model of the brain's perceptual predictions overwhelming the sensory data. And in a study a while ago, what we did with Keisuke Suzuki was took a panoramic video of Sussex campus, 360-degree video, and put every frame through this algorithm, and then people would strap on a VR headset and look around and have an unusual experience of Sussex campus. It's not normally like this on a Tuesday lunchtime. And people would argue, say, oh, it's a model, this is what, like a psychedelic trip. It's not really, I don't think, but the key thing here, it's a model of a different kind of experience. We're not modeling a different behavior or function, we're modeling an altered kind of experience, in this case a very dog-suffused kind of experience. And that was just a sort of initial illustration. It actually is kind of cool with the headset on because you really get immersed in this weird world. What we're doing now is taking this approach a bit further and trying to say something more specific about what's happening in different kinds of conditions that give rise to different kinds of hallucinations. So in Parkinson's disease, people have visual hallucinations. In Charles-Bonnet syndrome, after visual loss, they have visual hallucinations in psychedelics and in psychosis. And they all have different characters. Some are spontaneous, some are complex, some are geometric, and so on and so forth. So what we've been doing is trying to computationally dissect what's going on in these different conditions that explains these differences. And again, they're differences in experience, not primarily, and only secondarily in other things. So we build models based on these kinds of networks. Now I won't go into the details. They're coupled, generative, and discriminative networks. But we can simulate for different starting images. Oops, it's not rolling. That doesn't matter. Basically, these starting images get transformed in different ways according to the different configurations of this network, which try to simulate different kinds of hallucinations. And then what we do is we take output from these models to people who have these hallucinations, and we ask them which output of the model best matches your lived experience. So we can close a loop here. We can build a model of a particular kind of experience and validate it against those people's lived experience of these different hallucinations. That gives us a clue about what's happening under the hood to sort that out. So the slogan from all this is to think of a hallucination as a kind of uncontrolled perception where the brain's predictions lose their grip on the world. And by the same token, you can think of normal perception in the here and now as a kind of controlled hallucination. This is a term that's quite like to use. It emphasizes not that what we experience is made up, but that it comes from the inside out and is controlled by signals from the world and the body. And this has the implication that what we experience is not a veridical reflection of what's there, but as Anil put it, we do not see things as they are, we see them as we are. Even though it seems as though we have direct access to things in the world, that the brain is just reading out the world. It's not like that. We all have different brains, so we're all going to have different controlled hallucinations. We're familiar with this from this image here. Blue and black, how many? White and something else, how many? How many people, wrong answers, right, okay. First group was right. Of course, it's bistable, which is interesting. And this is a very fascinating thing, because I think it just shows that people are so surprised by how differently people can experience it. It's a great illustration of the fact that our perceptual experiences are not the same. And they don't have to be as dramatically different as elicited by this photo to still be real. So one project we're doing, I'll hopefully give you some results from next time I'm around, it's called the perception census, where we sampled individual differences in perception in using 55 different tasks organised into 10 different sections, 9 here plus a fundamentals one. It would take people several hours to do the whole thing, and we have 35,000 people have done at least one, and about 5,000 people have done all 55 tasks. So we've got a big data set now of individual differences in perception in many, many different dimensions, which will hopefully give us a clue about how different we are on the inside, in the way that we now recognise we all differ on the outside. We don't have to be massively different again for that to count. We have people from over 100 countries and aged from 18 to 90, I think, now in this data set. So I'm going to finish up in the next few minutes just with, well, actually, that's a lie. I've got two more things I want to say. One is a little bit about self, and then the last thing about AI, but I'll go quickly. So we'll move on to self now. And the basic idea about the self is, again, a little bit of a flip in how to think about it. So here's maybe the standard way to think about things. There's a world, we perceive the world, and maybe the self is the thing that does the perception, the little you inside your head that's doing the perception, that's then figuring out what to do, and the world changes, and we go round and round and round. Now that's, I think, the wrong way to look at things, and of course, I was at an evening at Jonathan's house earlier this week. Lots of people from the meditative tradition who'll be very well aware that this is a very naive way to think about the self, and the self, rather than being the thing that does the perceiving, is probably better thought of as a kind of perception itself, as a process of perception, not as a perceiver. And the idea here then is, of course, well, the same principles might apply. The self is a collection of controlled hallucinations. It's a collection of perceptual best guesses. And different aspects of the self may be different kinds of perceptual predictions. We have the bodily self, the experience of being or having a particular body, the experience of perceiving the world from a first-person point of view, the perspectival self, volitional self, what we think about when we think about free will. And only then things like the narrative and the social self that you associate with personal identity and a name and memories and plans and friends and so on. Now, all of these aspects of self can, they appear for most of us bound together in our daily experience, but they can come apart in the lab, in the clinic, and so on. And I want to focus just now on the bodily self and understand a little bit about how the bodily self is a kind of perception and based on perceptual predictions too. So the idea is the same idea. The brain has no direct access to the body, has to infer what the body is based on sensory signals, but now that come from the body, proprioception, interoception, and so on. And that determines what we experience as the body. There's a classic illustration of this. How many people have seen the rubber hand illusion? I think probably, hopefully all of you. Maybe not all of you, almost all of you. So in the rubber hand illusion, what's happening is it just shows how plastic, how malleable somebody's experience of what is the body can be. What happens is, so the subject here, his real hand is hidden from sight behind his cardboard partition. A fake hand is in front of him in roughly the right orientation and position that a real hand might be in, and it looks kind of handish. And he's looking at the fake hand, and the experimenter takes two paintbrushes and strokes both hands in time, in synchrony. And the idea is that the guy in blue, his brain is seeing a hand, it's not his hand, it's seeing a hand, it's seeing the hand be touched, but also feeling touch. So the perceptual inference is that, oh, hold on, that must be my hand, and you have this strange experience of ownership of the rubber hand. And this is what it looks like in practice. You stroke the hands, and then to test it, you can do many things, but this is by far the best way to test it. There's a reaction there that you don't get if the rubber hand is not assimilated. So this, I think, is super interesting in showing that we shouldn't take our experience of what is the body for granted. Now, there's an ongoing debate about what actually underlies the rubber hand illusion. The standard story is it's multisensory integration, tactile, visual signals combined together. But my colleague, postdoc Peter Lush, has done a huge study with the rubber hand illusion on 353 people, while also measuring, so he measures the strength of the illusion, but also measures how hypnotically suggestible they are. We're all hypnotically suggestible to some extent, and the thought here is that the setup of the rubber hand illusion is basically encouraging you to have an experience. It's what psychologists for decades have been calling demand characteristics. We have a situation where, hey, there's a hand, we're stroking it. Does it feel like your hand? It's a very leading set of questions. And the thought is that if it is due to demand characteristics, then more hypnotizable people will show stronger responses to the rubber hand illusion, and that's exactly what happens. So there's a strong correlation between rubber hand illusion scores and individual hypnotic suggestibility. And we're now looking at how this applies. There's a long story here. It's been a back and forth in the literature, which has been interesting. But it turns out a lot of things can correlate strongly with hypnotizability. This thing, the ASMR, autonomic median sensory response, people feel good when they watch videos of people folding handkerchiefs, that kind of thing, correlates very strongly. So does this, remember this one, the jumping pylon? There's a jumping pylon, and some people say they hear a sound. Again, strong demand characteristic, strong correlation. Everything is shaking. It's like, this is kind of weird, the whole screen is shaking a little bit, to accentuate the effect. But basic visual illusions like the Muller-Lyer illusion do not. So this is interesting. There are some phenomena where there's no correlation, which means that this is not subject to the same kind of top-down influence. It's another gloss on the old debate about cognitive penetrability here, but this in this case done by seeing which things correlate with hypnotic suggestibility and which don't. The other lesson from all this, is a tiny sidebar, is that demand characteristics must be controlled for. We've kind of forgotten about this a bit, given we've all got fancy brain imaging things now. But demand characteristics are hugely important. If we don't control for them, then the mechanisms we think are involved in a phenomenon really may not be. Instead, it might be the top-down expectations arising from the experiment that produce the experience. Okay. To finish up, there's a difference between having a body and being a body. And now we get into where Jonathan said about the importance of our biology. The body from the inside is also not directly accessible to the brain. It also has to be inferred, perceived. This is what we call interoception, the perception of the body from within. Blood pressure, heart rate, gastric tension, all these kinds of things. And the story, my argument is the same principle applies. Interoception, the sense of the body from within, is also a kind of predictive processing. But now this dance of prediction and prediction error happens entirely within the body itself. And the thought here is that what we experience when the brain is engaged in making predictions about what's going on inside the body, well, that's emotion. That's what we experience as emotion. That's the relevant content here. It's another way of what William James said many, many years ago, that bodily changes follow directly the perception of the exciting fact, the thing happening in the body. And that our feeling of the same changes as they occur is the emotion. So James here is basically saying emotions don't cause changes in the body. They're perceptions of changes in the body. And what I'm suggesting is merely that, well, if they're perceptions of changes in the body, it's a continuous story with a whole predictive processing story about perception. So emotion is the content of interoceptive predictions. There's one very important thing that characterizes predictions about the interior of the body, though, which is they don't really care about where things are. Perception of the body from within isn't about finding out what colour or shape the internal organs are. It's about control, regulation. Predictive models are very good ways of exerting control over things, keeping heart rate, blood pressure where it needs to be. And this brings up this whole other way of minimizing prediction error, which is active inference. We can minimize prediction error by updating our predictions, but by also making actions to change the sensory data. Carl Friston has called this active inference. And this is a way predictive processing can be thought of not as a way of figuring out what's there, but as a way of exerting control where your priors now become goals or set points. That's what you want the system to drive towards. There's many other sort of threads to this. Cybernetics has all been about control and regulation. I wrote about this a few years ago, about thinking about predictive processing in the context of cybernetics. And Carl Friston's free energy principle takes this to the extreme, where this process of predictive control becomes inherent to anything that continues to exist over time in a way where it does so actively. But back to the real problem, the idea here is that when the brain makes visual predictions, we have visual kinds of experiences. That's what visual predictions are about, like where things are and how they're moving and so on. But that interoceptive predictions underpin embodied experience, like different kinds of emotions. Control, is all about how well or badly something is going, and emotions are characterized primarily by valence, by things feeling good or bad in some way. So it's not so surprising that the phenomenological flip side of a prediction about the interior of the body should have the character of things feeling good or bad. But predictions about the world, much less so. Different kinds of predictions, different kinds of experience. And if you pull on this thread long enough, I think, and this is the argument that I'm really trying to make now, and I'm trying to make in the book, is that consciousness becomes very, very closely tied to life. Because this imperative for control and regulation goes right down into our cells, into individual neurons, into individual cells and their metabolism. I think this gives a nice reason, though I'm not fleshing it out here, to think that at minimum the mechanisms in our brain that underpin our conscious experience can only be understood in light of their fundamental role in keeping the body alive. But the stronger claim would be that there's an obligatory connection between living and experiencing. And that's still to be substantiated. It's a very different perspective from Descartes. Descartes said, every talk on consciousness has to have a pop at Descartes at some point. Descartes, when he was talking about non-human animals, he tended to deny any kind of consciousness to them, or at least the kind of consciousness that mattered. Without minds to direct their bodily movements, animals must be regarded as unthinking, unfeeling machines that move like clockwork. He called them bête machines, beast machines in French. And I think rather the opposite, entirely the opposite, that we are conscious and we have conscious selfhood because of and not in spite of our nature as living creatures, as being beast machines, that we perceive the world around us and ourselves within it through and because of our living bodies. So I realise I'm out of time, so I'm not going to talk about AI just to highlight what I would have talked about, which is consciousness and other things. We had a paper out yesterday, actually, in Trends, about how one might test for consciousness in all kinds of other things, whether it's non-human animals or AI or organoids and so on. They all raise different issues. But AI in particular, I'll talk about for 2 minutes, it's particular relevance now because it's growing so much in popularity and utility and competence too. Will AI become conscious? Well, there's no reason to assume that it will. Intelligence and consciousness are very different things. And we tend to think they go together, but they are different. Intelligence is doing the right thing at the right time, and consciousness is about having experience. There's no reason why just becoming more intelligent will suddenly make the lights of consciousness come on. I mean, we tend to think this because of two psychological biases, I think. We are anthropocentric, we see the world through human values. We think we're intelligent, we know we're conscious, so we tend to put the two together. And we're also anthropomorphic, we project human-like qualities into things that don't have them on the basis of superficial similarities. I think this is why some people think chat bots and language models like GPT are conscious, because they exert both our anthropocentric tendency to associate language with consciousness and our anthropomorphic tendency to project things like consciousness into things that seem to have language. And GPT does this. So we're very likely to make mistakes. By the way, they don't hallucinate. I think they rather confabulate when they make stuff up. I think that's a much more accurate description of what they do. And then the next, the real deep point now is that whether the stuff matters. Does stuff matter? Does it matter that we're made out of carbon rather than silicon? Does the wetware matter? And I think this is difficult to reach a firm position on, but I'd like you to consider that it might. The dominant view in consciousness research is computational functionalism, that consciousness is based on computations, that computations are sufficient. Get the right kind of computation or information processing, you get consciousness. This is a very deeply embedded assumption. But I think it's only an assumption. There are many things that complicate it. If computational functionalism is true, then in principle you could have conscious AI because it would if you could get it to do the right kind of computations. But you might not. There are lots of assumptions that would have to be satisfied. There are things like multiple realizability. You'd have to have the same functions that underpin consciousness in our brains be able to be implemented in an alternative system, and in particular when it comes to AI, in a system made out of different stuff. This is substrate neutrality, that the right kinds of things would have to be implementable in a different substrate. And there's really I think there's lots of good reason to think that might not be possible. That in brains, if you look inside a brain, you don't see the same sharp separation of mindware from wetware that you see between hardware and software in a computer. So that what brains do might not be separable from what they are. And that would mean that even if consciousness is a product of computations, those computations could not be separated from the kinds of things that brains actually are. And of course, consciousness might not even be a property of computation anyway. Jeff Hinton has come with this beautiful concept of mortal computation, which is another strong set of reasons that even if the brain is doing computation, it's of a kind that is not transportable to other things. You can't run the brain's software on another system. So I think lots of reasons to be skeptical about the possibility of conscious AI. And of course, we shouldn't even be trying to build conscious AI, in my view. There's lots of moral hazards around conscious AI, including things like value alignment. Would an AI system that is conscious, would it be harder or easier to align with human values? Would we be licensed in trying to align it with human values, given it would have its own moral considerability? And it could potentially suffer as well. We would have to have take an ethical stance towards systems that have experience in and of themselves. Even though I think it's very unlikely, I think we shouldn't even be trying to do it. But more worrying is that even AI that merely seems conscious is bad, and we're almost there already with these language models and deepfakes and things. There are lots of moral hazards surrounding AI that gives us the strong impression of being conscious. We're more vulnerable to social coercion. And then there's this, what I call the Westworld problem. Like we either decide to care about systems that seem conscious even though we know they're not, in which case we'll have less sort of moral considerability for other things, or we learn to not care about them even though we feel that they are conscious, which will be very bad for our minds. And this is what happens in Westworld. People start treating these conscious-seeming robots in all sorts of awful ways, and it's not good for them. So there's reasons why we should be very careful about building AI that gives the appearance of being conscious. It's a very dangerous thing to do. And what's worse, I think, is that these illusions of consciousness might be cognitively impenetrable. Even if we know that something is not conscious or strongly believe that it isn't, we might be unable to resist feeling that it is. In the same way that even though we know these lines are different lengths, we cannot help, or the same length, we cannot help but see them as different. But I think we underestimate this. I know that, so I'm not going to be susceptible. But we know this, we are susceptible. So I'll finish. I won't talk about organoids, but I think they're a much more likely situation where we'll see synthetic consciousness, because the whole debate about whether the stuff matters goes away. It is the same stuff. They just don't do much, so we don't tend to project consciousness into them. So it's a question of bias here. And I'll leave you with Frankenstein. I reread Frankenstein last year, about a year ago, and I actually realised on rereading it that I'd never read it. I actually read it for the first time. I assumed I'd read it. My memory was a false prediction. And on reading it for the first time, I realised that it's just as relevant now as ever, like all great literature. And Frankenstein's often thought to be a cautionary tale about the hubris of creating synthetic life, bringing life to something, the lightning bolt in the thunderstorm, the dark stormy night and all that. But if you read Frankenstein, read it again if you've read it, and read it if you haven't read it. What causes all the carnage is not the fact that Frankenstein's creature was brought to life, but it was that it was conscious. The creature had the capacity to feel rejection, misery, envy, resentment. That's what led to all the trouble. So Frankenstein, I think, is really a cautionary tale about our attempts to generate synthetic consciousness. And we should not make the same mistake, whether in reality or even in appearance. So I'll stop there. Thank you to these are all the people that have helped on various of the studies I've talked about. And I do have a bunch of open positions at the moment if people are interested in coming to sunny Brighton, where the weather is great and the surf is always on. There are 2 postdoc positions and 3 or 4 PhDs, depending on what the position is. in various aspects of what I've been talking about. So do reach out if you're interested, and if you know someone who would be, please spread the word. Thank you very much for your patience in allowing me to go on a little bit.